The standard way of looking at these problems is that we decide who to be. It requires in advance to know what to promise. My view is that if anyone's going to be in charge of you, it should be that later self, not the early one. She doesn't know what she's doing.
Hey, humans! Welcome to this week's Demystifying Science.
We have a real gem of a conversation to share with you today.
Like a finely polished opal, this one.
We just got off the VidPhone with a University of Chicago philosopher, Professor Agnes Callard.
Her work is all about the big questions of being a human. Virtue, moral reasoning, and how humans become their future selves.
She's been wrestling with these questions since 2008, when she finished her doctorate at the University of California, Berkeley, and started her teaching career at the University of Chicago.
In addition to tackling such topics as the moral psychology of emotions, deliberation, and the weakness of will during her classes, she also hosts the philosophy event of the millennium, the Night Owls series, which is a late-night discussion where students and professors philosophize on topics like sex, death, artificial intelligence, or whatever.
She's been the recipient of numerous prestigious awards and fellowships, like the Guggenheim, and her career shows no signs of slowing down.
Aside from her academic accomplishments, she regularly contributes to public philosophical discourse by participating in various podcasts, offering a monthly column in The Point magazine, and releasing essays in venues like New York Times, New Yorker, and the Boston Review.
She's also the author of a book, Aspiration, The Agency of Becoming. We'll put it in the description.
Our conversation ranged from discussion of the differences between science and philosophy, how aspiration can work on the species level, and how status gains can bring people together, maintain a useful level of separation, or even drive them apart.
And how they might make it harder for alpha-Flossians and humans to get to know each other. It's an awesome conversation that we will definitely continue in the future.
Please subscribe to our channel right now so we can bring you more fascinating conversations like this one. Costs you nothing, helps us immensely. So enjoy the wisdom, Dr. Agnes Callard, and tell us what you think.
See you next week, humans!
Well, hello.
Hey!
Hi.
So you're a real human philosopher.
I think so, yeah.
That's amazing.
What's the difference between philosophy and science on Earth?
I give a lot of different answers to that question depending on my mood. I'll tell you the one that's I'm in the mood for today.
Yeah.
I think that there are some questions where, like, we almost can't ask them because our need to have an answer is so pressing that we, like, answered as soon as we asked it, right? So it's like, you know, there are just things where it's really hard for us to suspend judgment about it. Just be like, I don't know. One kind of simple example would be just like, suppose you really, really want something, like you really want a certain job, or you really want someone to say yes when you ask them on a date, or, and so you might be like, are you able to suspend judgment about that? I think no. Like, I think what you do is you vacillate between hope and despair, right? You're always ready with an answer. You're like, I know they're going to say yes. I know they're going to say no. Okay. And so what happens there is, like, there's this space, there's this freedom where between the question and the answer that's not there when you really need to know the answer. Okay. I think that scientific questions, at least questions that involve measurement in particular, are questions where it's really quite easy for us to see the gap between the question and the answer. It's like, suppose I just want to measure, like, this is not heavy duty science or whatever, but I want to measure how tall this is, right? It's like, I don't go into that feeling like I already know the answer, you know? But philosophical questions, they're questions about, you know, like, what is courage? What is it to be a good person? How should you live your life? What is happiness? Does the external world exist?
Would you say those are more like spiritual matters versus object-focused matters?
I think it's just that we need to know the answer. I don't think that they're more spiritual or more object focused. It's like imagine what it would really be to say to yourself, I don't know what the point of human life is. It's like, what am I doing then? What am I doing sitting here? Like my life is like pointless. Like, how do I go on? How do I even take a breath? Right?
So is there an objective way to achieve that understanding?
So I think a lot of times the word objective is actually a way to pick out that scientific distance and detachment, right? Where it's very tolerable to me not to know how tall this bottle is. I can sit here and just be here not knowing it, right? It's okay. I don't know it. That's fine. It's really not urgent for me, right? And that, so, and then I can go measure it and then I know, right? And so that's one way to think about objectivity is that distance. With philosophy, we don't have that distance. We always immediately have an answer. We're like, I know what courage is. Courage is doing things even though you're afraid, right? People just quickly give you an answer, really quickly. Can you inquire into those things and produce better answers? Absolutely. And that's what philosophy is. Philosophy is getting past those immediate reflexive responses. The point is that those reflexive responses are always there and you always have to fight them and deal with them. And so philosophy inherently has to involve something like refutation. So I think philosophy really got its start with Socrates, who would walk up to people and ask them questions and they'd be like, that's obvious, that's easy, I know the answer. Sometimes they would say that's easy like 6 times in a row. Because of course we all know what it is to be a good person, right? And then he's like, wait, I have a question. It's not clear to me yet. Let me ask you a follow-up. Let me ask you another question. That's philosophy. So philosophy is sort of asking people questions that almost can't be asked because they're so quick to think that they already know the answers to them.
And you said something interesting about what does it mean to be a good person in there, right? Where it's a question that everyone seems to know the answer to. Is that the case? Is that the case that people have a sense of what moral is? Because from out here, it seems like that might not be the case.
So, I mean, there's a question, are they right to think they know the answer? And then there's a question, do they think they know the answer? And I'm only saying the second thing.
And what if they're in conflict? What if their answers are in conflict with one another?
They usually are. So, all I'm claiming about it's being a philosophical question is that, in effect, there's a kind of immediate response that people produce. Those immediate responses aren't always consistent with one another. Right. So if you think about the case of like asking someone on a date, in 1 minute you're filled with hope and in another minute you're filled with despair. And so you're like, she's going to say yes. Oh, she's definitely going to say no. Those are not consistent with one another. Right. But at any given moment, you feel like you need to have a thought about what's going to happen. Philosophy is like that, only way worse. So their answers tend not to be consistent, but they are reliably present.
So it seems like many of the questions of science for humans are not necessarily questions that the average person would have an answer to, in your opinion.
So what I think is that questions become scientific questions when it becomes okay for the average person not to have an answer to them. And so, like questions about cosmology, like, in the ancient world, the idea that you have a basic sense of like where you are in the order of things, that was like, it's kind of like a required, like it's part of what it is to know where you are in the world, right? But that becomes less important to people, less necessary to their thinking. And, I would say like, as it becomes less necessary, it becomes more scientifically tractable because people are okay with not knowing the answer, and that allows them to inquire into it. But there's a certain way in which, say, the heroism of someone like Galileo and this transition to seeing, questions about the relative motions of the Earth and the Sun and all that as scientific is like one way to put that is it stopped mattering to us, so we could approach it scientifically. It stopped being necessary to know the answer, and so then we could be detached and objective.
So how did you come to focus on the question of aspiration so deeply? How did that come to be the question? Oh, interesting.
I was working on something else. I was coming up with a theory about it. And I was really confident this was like a pretty good theory. And I was going and giving talks, and the audiences kept refuting my theory. They kept being like, this really doesn't fit. Let me give you a counterexample. Here's another counterexample. And I'm like, you're making a really good point, but I think I'm still right. And I kept like doing this. And then I'm like, I had this realization that my theory was a good theory, but it was a theory of something else. So I shifted like the topic of the theory, and then it all worked.
Is that normal that you go to talks and
it's
people?
Super weird.
Huh.
Oh, sorry. Let me let you finish. Is it normal that you go to talks and people refute you? Yes, that part's normal.
I see. So that's an important part of philosophy is disagreement?
Yes.
So it seems like science and philosophy kind of overlap in that sense, because with science, there's oftentimes great disagreement about the ways that things fit together. The story that we tell ourselves in science seems that humans mirror the sort of the Alva-Flacian perspective, right? Where we tell ourselves a story of how things happen, and the way that we fit those pieces together can be very different sometimes. And so there's a lot of conflict. There's a lot of anger, a lot of emotions.
Negotiating a narrative in both cases, perhaps.
Yes. So I think that it's an interesting thing. I would say it's something like what happens is that whenever anyone becomes invested in pursuing any question, it becomes sort of necessary for them to have an answer to it. So even if it's a scientific question, say you want to understand like how DNA works or something, what you're going to end up with, if you're seriously pursuing that question, at some point you'll end up with a theory, right? And you're not a totally detached, observer of that theory. You're invested in it, right? And you're trying to make it be true in some way. And scientists are no less susceptible to that kind of investment than anybody else. I would say it's like at that point they're in a way a bit philosophical, a bit in there, and philosophers just have like a lot more of that.
Well, it's interesting. I want to get back to your work on aspiration in a second, but we were just talking with an astrophysicist, this Earthling named David Lindley, and he just finished a book up about how modern physics, in his opinion, is approaching something closer to philosophy than science. Particularly because it's approaching these wider where are we sort of ideas, like cosmology in general. So we're trying to kind of nail down the overlap between the two disciplines on Earth since then.
Yeah, I mean, one thought would be like, it's like when you put it as where are we, you might think that's a question that any human being has to have a take on, right? Like she has to, it's like, how do you walk around the world without any sense of where you are? Like, how do you even take another step, right? And you might think all of your movements, all of your thoughts, all of your sort of spatial mapping of the world around you is sort of like predicated on taking yourself to have answered in some way these questions, right? And then what you can learn is that like people can interrogate you and your answers can be kind of crummy, but you have to have produced some answers. The answers are in some way necessary. And so I think that that's right, that in every part of science, there's the part that touches philosophy, and that's the part where it's sort of necessary to have some kind of answer for everyone.
You mentioned that there's this incomprehensibility or incongruence in the answers that people often give. Things don't fit together. There are cracks in it. What do you make of that? Is that just an inherent aspect of being human? The fact that you come together with these sorts of half-formed perspectives?
Is it a failure of language?
No, language is the solution to it. It is, so imagine that like, in order to even take a step, in order to even move forward, you had to have already answered a bunch of questions. Like, why go anywhere? Why do anything? What's the point of life? How should you interact with others, etc.? Like, you just had to. Imagine you had like a chart of questions, and it's like answer all these questions before you do anything ever, right? Okay, so you do that, right? Your answers are probably not going to be that good. Like, you didn't have a lot of time to think about them, right? And so I think that our answers to these questions are not that good because we have to have them and we produce them immediately and reflexively. I think that they become better over time in two different ways. One way they become better over time is that an individual person who uses language to have conversations improves her answers to these questions. I've improved my answer to the question, like, what is philosophy? Just from having been asked it, like, as an academic, doing my academic philosophy work, I rarely got asked that question, but doing podcasts and things, I'm asked it more, and like, I can do different versions of it, and I'm better at it, right? We get better by talking. So an individual person, but I also think humanity gets better at it because we store the intellectual resources that earlier philosophers create. So very simple things like the distinction between subject and a subject, like a thing and its properties, and the idea that some of the properties are accidental and they sort of inhere in it as accidents, and then there's the thing itself and its properties, and they're distinct but they're one. That's Aristotle. He came up with that. He came up with the categories and with the idea of like time and place and stuff as ways of organizing the world. We all now do that reflexively. We've inherited a lot of philosophy in the basic way that we think and talk about the world, and so we do it better than people in earlier times did.
And you think that's made the world on Earth a better place, an easier place to live in, a place with less suffering?
So I think maybe, the question, what makes life good, is a philosophical one, but I think one of the main things that makes it good is knowledge. And so in that respect, it's improved the world because it's improved everyone's grasp of what they're doing.
Like it's easier to handle somehow?
Like it's easier to know like how these two things both exist but are separate from one another. Like if you're in the time of Parmenides, who was like kind of a pre-Socratic philosopher, and he's like, I don't get how there could be two things and they both exist but they're not the same. Okay. He's like, I just don't get that. Right. And there's a lot of philosophy that goes into trying to solve that problem, which to us seems like really easy problem, right? But it's easy to us because people did a lot of work on it. So that's just like our thought has been clarified through categories and concepts that didn't used to exist. But I also think in terms of human suffering, absolutely. Like we, on Earth, I'm curious what you guys think about this, but we believe that there's something like human rights. There has not. Some people think there are also animal rights. I've never heard of an alien rights movement, so I'm curious what you guys think about that. But yeah. Do you guys have rights?
It's kind of weird on our planet. First of all, philosophy is kind of a toolkit on our planet for moving into other applications like science and technology, so on and so forth. But
and we do have rights, but it is more universal life rights.
It's like everything is connected in the Alvoplossian way of looking at the world. So an animal doesn't exist independently of its surroundings. And
we've had other humans ask us about the ways that, how do we understand the preeminence of Alvoplossians? And it seems like on Earth, among the humans, there's a sense that the humans are the most important ones. And so there's been a process of establishing human rights, but there isn't necessarily a process by which humans seem to have established the right of life itself to coexist with humans.
Well, some humans believe, for instance, that non-human animals have certain rights and rights to coexist, and some humans even believe that about plants. So it depends on which humans you're talking to. Okay. But I'm curious, are there crimes like where you are on your planet? Do people ever commit crimes? What would be an example of a crime?
Well, all the worst things imaginable can and do happen, unfortunately. But
violation of consent is mostly our framework for morality. When you violate the consent of those around you, the creatures that are born and have not yet necessarily been born, that's when you commit the greatest crimes. And the degree to which you violate consent decides the punishment that one receives.
Good. And so if you go back in the history of your planet, has this idea that violations of consent are immoral. Have you always thought that, or was there like a time at which you came to discover that?
Well, a lot like your planet, we started off with a priest class that sort of acted as the intermediary to gods who dictated moral code. But we realized this was sort of insufficient at some point because individuals were always forced to rely on someone else to make decisions.
And there were deep-seated corruptions. The moment that Alba Flacians gave up their agency of understanding and of coming to a decision, you came to realize that there would be a creature external to you who was deciding what was best. And there was this issue with obedience, because we found that Alba Flacians would obey without having an understanding of why they obeyed. And so, in order to create a system where morality was more innate, we came to learn how to behave in ways that would allow us to behave morally.
So in my world, the people who helped us learn that were philosophers. And that's that's a big part of what philosophy is. Like, if I were going to say, what is the single biggest achievement that humans have done over their history? There's many achievements, but I would say number one is the recognition of the existence of human rights. I would say that's the biggest thing human beings have done. We didn't used to understand that there were these rules for how you have to treat people. Now we do. And it was mostly philosophers of one kind or another. And the earlier end, it was sort of religious philosophers. And then later, the kind of, I would say the full development, you'd be hearing someone like Immanuel Kant.
So was that achieved with an argument?
It took a long time. Yeah, many arguments, not just one. And it took a long time. Right? It was an idea that was bigger than the people who were developing it. And in a lot of ways, we are still working it out. We are still coming to understand even that something like, what is wrong with racism? Why is it important that gay people be allowed to marry? Those are, I take it, kind of extrapolations of this idea of human rights that we haven't fully squeezed all the juice out of it yet. We're still working on it. So it's not one person, it's many people, but it wasn't a thing that was obvious from the start.
Was it derived multiple times in different cultures?
So I don't know about all of those. Like, I know about one cultural tradition. And even that, I don't know all of it. But I would say that, the dominant thread is through sort of Christianity and then the Enlightenment, right? Where, I think that there's a version of it in Homer too. Like, it just depends on how open-minded you're going to be about counting something as an incipient version of an idea, right? But there's this idea that there's something kind of inviolable and dignified that belongs to, at the start, just every human being, right? Then there are questions about other non-human animals. And, it has a lot of different manifestations. There's a weird manifestation of it in Plato, where I think at certain points it almost seems like what he thinks is that human beings are gods. They're mortal gods who can die. And so that's why we have to respect one another, because there's something divine in us. And I think you do have that in Christianity. There's something divine in the human. But then eventually I think it gets articulated, in the form of liberalism, this idea that there's a kind of basic, non-interference that we should have with respect to one another. So it's a little bit like your consent idea, right? So by the time you get to, say, Mill or something, like, the idea is that, there's a sphere of freedom that part of what it is for me to be a human rational creature is that there's a sphere of freedom that I have to act in certain ways and to not be interfered with.
And that began really with liberalism?
No, I would say liberalism is sort of how is the kind of final articulation or late articulation of that, right?
I see.
That is the idea that a human being has a kind of like, dignity and preciousness and divinity. You can find that in Homer, you can find it in Plato, right? And where that idea has very little to do with non-interference. So it develops into that thought about non-interference. Yeah.
I see.
And is this a sort of species level aspiration, do you figure? You speak of aspiration on the level of individuals, but it seems like a question of human rights is something that happens on a larger scale than just an individual. And so is it possible for an entire species to aspire to something?
Yeah, I mean, this is a question I asked myself, and I myself felt it was a lacuna in my book that I didn't know the answer. I think that if there are species-wide aspirations, then something like the domain of knowledge and is one of the areas in which those aspirations occur, right? Like our hunger to understand the way the world works and the way we ourselves work is like bigger than what can fit in a lifetime. And so, yes, I think there is something like that. And people have even a kind of sense that they're going to die without, themselves getting to the answer. So it's a bit like Moses, who gets to look over and see the promised land, but he can't enter it. So I think there is something like that, but I haven't myself produced a theory of how that works, like how it's possible to be part of an aspirational project that you will never see to the end of.
It's also interesting in your book, you talk about the difference between ambition and aspiration. And Quinn's question just now sort of opens up the idea that perhaps self-preservation is a primary motivator, and the aspirational aspect is secondary for some folks.
You mean on a species level too?
Yeah, on the species level.
Interestingly, I think even with respect to moral aspirations, some people can think of them sort of ambitiously, like take eliminating racism. Okay. I think the way a lot of people think of that is, I know exactly what it would be for there to be no racism. I'm just not sure how to bring that about. Or maybe I even know how to bring it about, but I don't have the tools or I can't force people, or I can't, whatever, right? Or maybe I do know and I'm going to try and do it. Right? That would be an ambition. It wouldn't be aspiration, because I understand exactly what the valuable state is, right? And it's just like, we're not there yet.
So aspiration is about discovering the value.
Exactly. It's that you see, the value, like the coming to value as itself a learning process, right? Where it's like someone like Mill, he wrote about the subjugation of women. He was one of the people who's starting to see that like the basic ideas of human rights and liberalism entailed different views about, how we think about gender than what existed in his time, right? He's like, we need to think about this differently. But like, he certainly didn't get to the bottom of all the other issues that we have to also think about differently once we, embrace certain aspects of liberalism, right? So it was like, there was still a lot of learning left to do. And there was a lot of learning left to do sort of pre-Mill, certainly, right? So there, it's like there are moral realizations or forms of moral awakening that hadn't happened yet. One question you might have is like, do we still have those to look forward to? And I suspect we do. And those are very hard to anticipate. But people in the future will look back at us and say, wow, they were really morally screwed up in all these ways.
Do you have a sense for what those would look like? Like when you go through your life on a day-to-day basis, are there moments that you look around and flash into a future that hasn't happened yet, where you consider the ways in which you were complicit in something like that?
Yeah. So here's one. So I think a lot of people have senses of what these are that I disagree with. Like, like one of them is like that it may be right that, say, animal rights becomes a big thing in the future. Like in the future, it is viewed as evil to eat animals or whatever. But that doesn't seem to me to be a very radical transformation, in the sense that could just become, there's just a thing that a lot of people are doing now that more people could be doing. But here's one that I think is a radical one that maybe I'm wrong about it. But I think that something we've gone back and forth on as a culture is like, how okay is it to break bonds of friendship and love? So if I'm dating someone, say, and then I don't feel like dating them anymore, I can break up with them. Or suppose like my parents, are kind of annoying. I'm an adult and I don't feel like dealing with them. Maybe I see them as toxic. We right now we're at a point in our culture where we see the breaking off of relationships as just like totally morally okay, basically under all circumstances. We're very permissive about that, except for parent and child going that like towards my own children. That would be heavily sanctioned. But otherwise, if I want to divorce my husband, if I want to break up with my best friend, if I want, it's like, that's just the world we live in is a world in which that's totally permissible. I suspect that in the future that will not be true.
But it wasn't true in the past, right?
Right. I think we've swung too far. I think that like we have, like we kind of, it's almost like we drunk a little bit on this idea of totally elective formation of attachments. And I think that there's something right about that. But that we have underrated how significant those attachments are once they have been formed, even if you should have agency in forming them. And there are these lifelong wounds that we inflict on ourselves and other people when we break up. And so it's not so much that I think we'll live in a world in which divorce is impossible. I think divorce will always be possible. I think divorce is a great thing. We should have it. But I think it'll be more like you can't just cut someone out of your life. Like that's not a thing you're just allowed to do. Like you have, once you're in a relationship with someone, in some sense, you have certain kinds of duties and connections to that person forever. And you have to work through the breakup in a way that is like okay to both of you, except under terrible circumstances. So that's a moral change that I sort of envision, a change in our moral sensibilities of like how free we are in relation to one another.
That's very interesting because I've found that humans are so averse to conflict that they would prefer to abscond from a relationship rather than actually confront it.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think like, one place, I think we've become more averse to conflict, I suspect, because as our relationships have become more elective, right? So it's like you can choose to affiliate with people where there's a low conflict. And then part of the problem is that there are some people where we can't make a choice, like our fellow countrymen, right? Most of us don't choose what country we live in. And so you end up in these political struggles where there might be like two political groups and they like can't get along and they can't break up because we're not going to have two countries. And so like,
and you're about to leave the planet too. So you guys are going to have to stick together somehow.
Yeah, we'll see. We'll see if we manage it. But I think that there are many, many people with whom you have to be able to get along. And like in the first instance, it's like your fellow countrymen. And so kind of training to get along with like the person who happens to be your sister or your neighbor or your spouse or your ex-spouse, that like, and learning to manage the conflicts and to be in them and to think that they're not the end of the world. I think that humanity has a lot of learning to do on that front.
So you have some firsthand experience with this, if I'm not mistaken. You took a rather courageous position and, if I understand it, wrote some essays, gave some talks about your own divorce experience with a colleague, right?
Yeah, my ex-husband is my colleague, and we did an event. I run a late night debate series at the University of Chicago, and it's sort of like philosophy questions that don't get discussed in philosophy class. And one of them was philosophy of divorce. So my ex-husband and I did this thing on what is marriage and what are you committing to when you marry someone, and is there such a thing as a way to be divorced? And I think there is, and that's not a good thing. So, and I have actually written about it too, but that thing hasn't come out yet. So okay. It probably will come out relatively soon, but I've written something about this breakup, sort of ethics of breakup question.
What did your
Yeah.
students take? What did you hope that your students took from that?
They were super into it. We could not fit like half the people that wanted to attend that event in the space that we had for it. It was totally packed, but people can watch it on YouTube.
Wow.
I think that I didn't want them to take anything different from any of the other events, namely, like, here's an interesting question. Like, here's one of the biggest decisions that we make in our lives. How should we think about it in prospect? What is it for marriage to succeed? What is it for divorce to succeed? And also just to be like a lot of people get divorced and I think they're unprepared, like, to think about it, because it's like something we don't like to think about. And I think it's good to be, like, in your dating period, to be like thinking about this, like, as being like not the end of the world, and also as being something that can be managed well. Like, that you might think of divorce as failure. And one of the dangers there is then that you're not going to hold yourself up to standards in doing it well. Because how can you do failure well? Failure is failure, right? And I think divorce isn't failure, and it's something where you have to live up to doing it well. And that is possible. So I think it's sort of worth thinking about in those terms.
How does this tie into status games? Does it tie into status games?
I don't immediately see how it does, but I'm happy to just think about status games for a bit.
Well, so my question is, you talk about status games in terms of new relationships. The meeting that you have with someone is a process of signaling to one another various things about yourself.
Yeah.
Is there something in a relationship where, if it never settles down away from these status games, that the relationship has to be terminated at some point?
Good. So I do think that status games sort of show up maybe in three places. One is first meetings and first encounters, where in effect you are transmitting a lot of information to one another that is not indirectly about who you are. Right?
And there's a falseness to that sometimes too, right? Where I hear that on Earth people get divorced because there's something incorrect about the status transmission.
Right. So I think, the initial interaction, it's almost like there's a kind of status negotiation that's happening. And then with respect to some people in your life, every conversation with them is like that. These tend to be people you're not very close to. So maybe colleagues, right? People you have sort of incidental encounters with. But most people, like, once you're close to them, once you're friends with them, there's very little of that, or less of that status negotiation. I think that there can, but it also becomes less tolerable, like becomes less okay for it to be there, right? It's like fine in an initial encounter, and then less and less okay the better you know the person. And so when you say, like, oh, this can happen in marriages, like, I do think that when it happens in the context of a marriage, it's upsetting to people because you want to be in this position of trust with respect to the person that you're close to, where there isn't a question about the hierarchy in which you stand towards one another. There isn't even a question of you're being equal. Like, neither of those questions arises, because in some sense, like, you're not two separate people. You're kind of living one life, right? So yeah, I do think that these things be kind of grate on us in the context of a marriage, and that can show up in, like, oh, you never do the dishes, and, like, you say you're going to and you don't. Is this that you think your time is more important than mine? That sort of thing. That's where a status game could show up in the context of, like, a marriage.
So is the goal to eliminate these games in any relationship eventually?
Should they happen at first contact?
Like, are they teleological?
Are we going to have to status game our way through Earth when we get there?
I think it will be hard to play status games with you. For the reason I wrote this op-ed on treating Aristotle as an alien. And I think that aliens are like not part of our status network. So we don't know where to place you guys. We don't know how important you are. We don't know what it would mean to be more or less important than you. And so you're actually uniquely positioned to not play status games.
Phew.
I am not sure that's a good thing. It may be that there are many things about humans you're not going to learn because these games are important to us and you won't get a chance to play them.
What do you think we could miss, though? Because we'll watch them playing status games with one another. Is it something that you have to participate in to fully understand?
I think so. I think that like there's a sort of set of emotions that you feel in when you engage in these games, where, for instance, you feel proud if somebody does something that recognizes you in some way, recognizes your significance. And then also there's a kind of shared humility, right? Where in effect you're saying, oh, we both suffer in certain ways, right? So there's a kind of a weird bonding and anti-bonding that's happening that has a kind of emotional component. And that I think is a deep part of what it is for humans to recognize another as belonging in some sense to them, right? So it's almost like one way to think about it is, if another human comes up to me and starts talking to me, they're pretty sure that I'm human because I look human, right? But like, I could be a cleverly disguised something else, right? And it's sort of in the playing of these games that we learn what we are together. We learn that we are the same species, right? And you're not the same species as us. We look at you, you already don't look human. And so there's this question, on what terms do we communicate with you? And maybe the only terms are information transfer. But that is to miss a certain characteristic activity that we engage in.
Is the status game a place where people learn what to aspire to?
I think sometimes it can be. So, one important like relationship in which you can be to someone is like they can be your mentor, right? And a mentor, like there's a certain characteristic recognition that you do of your mentor, right? And then also you almost like embody them with certain powers to direct you and orient you. So like if a student comes to my office hours, okay, they'll walk in and they'll say, I'm sorry, I'm sure you're really busy. Okay. Like usually I was sitting there like doodling or coloring or whatever. Right? But they always think I was so busy. Okay. Why are they saying that? Why are they assuming it? They're not acting, I don't think. They're that's sincere, right? But it's like, they're like, you're really important, and part of what it is for them to think of me as important is it allows them to think that my guidance of them and my opinions and my judgment are important and can then have an effect on them, right? So they're giving me a power that they want me to have because they want it to have an effect on them. And I think that's very important for certain kinds of aspiration, for many kinds of aspiration, where mentorship is, figures so centrally because aspirants don't know what they're doing. And so they need someone to help them. And so, yes, I would think that you would find it harder to engage in a kind of aspirational activity that might involve mentors exactly because you can't play this game. Or maybe you'll learn though.
That's fascinating.
So I wanted to go back to the notion of morality as it occurs on Earth versus on our planet, where this is kind of ecological actually. Curious how you weigh in on it. But we're really concerned with the future on our planet. So even the unborn are subject to the moral consequences of our action. So we try to consider the distance and the unrealized in our decision making. And I was really fascinated in your book how you talked about inverting the paradigm of who's in control, the future self versus the immediate self. Can you speak to how that would first of all, do people agree with you about this? And second of all, what does that make a human? Is a human a object on the earth right now? Is a human an idea that occurs? Like, how can you be directed by something that hasn't occurred yet? It's a really fascinating idea. I think you're onto something there.
Yeah, good. I think it's the most difficult idea in the book. And I don't know yet whether people are convinced by it. I think if there's anything they're inclined to be unconvinced by, it's that. I think that the way I came to it is that the standard way of looking at these problems is that we sort of like decide who to be and we make a bunch of commitments, almost like we make promises, where it's like, okay, I promise I'm going to work hard every day. I'm going to read these books. I'm going to do this and I'll become a philosopher. And the problem with that is that it requires me in advance to know what to promise and to know what to commit to and to know what to do when I have the least amount of information, right? Which is at the very beginning. It's at the end that I'll have the answers to those questions. What should you commit to? What should you do, right? I'm trying to become the kind of person who will know the answers to the question. And so my view is that, if anyone's going to be in charge of you, it should be that later self, not the early one. She doesn't know what she's doing. Now, having your later self be in charge of you is problematic because your later self doesn't exist yet, right? And so it means that, in effect, the person whose judgments are the arbiter of the rightness and wrongness of what you're doing doesn't exist yet. That's not that puzzling in the sense, it just means you can't know, right? It means you'll know when you get there and you'll be able to judge retrospectively. It doesn't mean that we have reverse causation, right? Like that is, that future self doesn't get to like make choices that affect me. She just gets to be the one who decides whether I've succeeded or failed. And I'm in effect trying to live up to her, right? And one way to think about it is you can try to live up to what your parents think of you. You can try to live up to what your teachers think of you. And I think you can try to live up to what you in the future is going to think of you, right? Whenever you're doing that, you're doing it with a lot of uncertainty about what it would be for them to approve of you and what it would be to live up to them. We never have a clear conception of what our parents want from us or what our teachers want from us. And so the fact that we don't have a clear conception of what our future self is going to want from us does make that case be so different. And quite often that aspirational project requires you to leverage your parents and your teachers and these other people as kind of proxies for your future self, right? So that's sort of how I think the causal story goes. But your thought about, the future generations is yet another step of the story, which almost relates more to the idea of aspiration over more than one generation, right? And you might think, in addition to thinking about like, my future self as the arbiter, we can also think about the future generations of humans that are going to judge us. And I think that's right. And that is a right way we should think. We should think we're morally trying to live up to being the kind of people who are going to look back and make certain kinds of judgments about people we are now. And we're trying to do our best. And we want to live up to them and not to the people we are now, because the people we are now are like a bit defective.
Do you have strategies for incentivizing that kind of behavior on Earth?
I've heard lots of humans express the idea that concern for future generations isn't really that valuable.
I think that there are people often express ideas that they don't actually live by. So that's one of them, I would say. Here's an example that a weird way of giving an example, but there's this movie, Children of Men. I don't know if you've seen it. And there's a book too, science fiction book. It's really good. And it's about like sort of the infertility scenario. So what would happen if just like starting today, there was just infertility among human beings, so that like this is the last generation in effect, right? So no big like, comet comes and destroys the earth, no disease. It's just like there are no more babies, right? And in the book and also in the movie, there is the conceit that this would just be devastating for human beings, that basically everybody would lose their sense of the meaning of what they were doing. And I think it's very plausible, psychologically very plausible, that it would be devastating. And you might wonder, like, why? You can just live your life the way you were going to live it, right? Your kids, your kids are not going to have kids, but your kids are still going to get to grow up. You're going to die in normal old age. But I think what these sort of works of art explore is the degree to which we are actually predicating the value of what we're doing in 1,000 different ways on the thought that there's going to be these future people. So like this podcast, right? It'll be watched by people, and those people will like talk to other people about it, and those people will have kids. And like, if we knew none of that was going to happen, and it's just like, however many people watch it, like until 50 years from now, and then it's done, you feel like a lot less motivated to do it. And like, I'm writing a book right now. It's like, would I write a book if I knew we were left? How many people are going to read it, right? So So a lot of the things that we invest ourselves in, I mean, suppose you're a scientist and you're trying to cure cancer, whatever. It's like, well, what's the point, right? So there would be a lot of what's the pointing if we were the last generation. And that just shows you that actually we are relying on the existence of future generations to kind of like underwrite the meaning of a lot of our ordinary everyday activities, even when we don't notice it.
Do you trust people when they say they think there is no meaning to life? Or are they hiding from something?
I think that it's hard to give a generic answer to that question. Like if one of my students said that, I would interrogate them about it. And I would be like,
is everything okay?
Not even that. Like, I would just be like, I want to understand what you mean by that. It's not a sentence I would just let sit. Let's put it that way. But I think that people can mean so many different things by it, and quite often what they mean by it is, I don't want to get into a big philosophy conversation with you right now. Right? So and that's fine. Right. But sometimes what they mean is, I want to do philosophy and you better prove to me that there's something here. Right. So I could only figure out which of those positions they're in by talking to them, I guess. And so it's not so much a matter of do I trust them as a matter of I need to ask them more questions to figure out which of these various positions they're in. And then that would determine what questions I would ask next.
And what if they lie? What's the role of lying on Earth? Is lying always bad?
It seems to me that someone who says, and really sticks to it, because I've seen humans who do this, who assert that, I think they call themselves nihilists, who assert that there is no meaning. Is it possible that they're lying out of some deep-seated wound, or for other reasons? Or is it possible that they're actually telling the truth and they really do think that there's nothing?
So, a couple of thoughts here. One of them is that, as we said earlier, when people answer philosophical questions, they don't tend to answer them consistently. So even if they're being perfectly sincere, another minute later, they might say things that commit them to the existence of value. Now, lying. One thing that I find interesting about philosophy is it's one of the areas where it sort of doesn't matter whether people lie. Like, suppose I'm talking to someone, right, about philosophy. Suppose you're talking to me about philosophy, right? And I'm telling you all my views and I'm giving you arguments. But suppose all this were lies. Suppose what I actually believe was some other thing. You can still either learn from what I've said or not. Like, who cares whether I think it, right? What am I? I'm just like a thing sitting here, right? That is, your entire interaction with me is only intellectual, right? So as long as I can argue for whatever it is I'm saying, it's sort of like, did Shakespeare write the plays of Shakespeare, or did somebody else who we call Shakespeare write? It's like, it doesn't really matter, right? So now the problem with lying tends to be that people are actually not very good at defending views when they're lying. They become poor at thinking when they lie. And so as a matter of fact, you don't want people lying in philosophical conversations, I think, just because they won't be good interlocutors, not because they're being evil. But in other contexts, lying is quite different. So I think quite often, we rely on speech in order to coordinate our behavior with other people. And we also rely on speech to acquire factual information. And lying violates the norms that underwrite both of those activities. They're not typically that relevant to philosophy, but they are relevant to these other contexts. And so we view that as immoral because we view it as a kind of like a defecting from a shared activity. Right. And you can almost think of it in your consent model. In effect, we see people as, like, when they speak to us, consenting implicitly to say true things.
Could it also be symptomatic of a weakness of will?
To lie?
Because it's easy, do you mean?
Yeah.
Sure. So there are lots of reasons why people lie. I think that, and weakness of will could be one of them. In the sense that would be a case where they know they shouldn't be lying, all things considered.
Are there good times to lie?
Arguably there are times when the consequential effects of not lying would be so devastating that you should lie. One way to think about it might be, you could be in a situation, like I could be in a situation with someone where I know that if I could explain to them all of the details of what's happening, they would consent to me lying to them, but they can't, right? And I might say, then it's probably totally fine to lie. If I can reasonably expect that they would want me to lie to them under these circumstances, right? So that would be one kind of weird case. But there could also be cases where, like, there's an evil murderer at the door and they ask, they're extremely trusting evil murderers, so they're going to believe what I say. And they ask, like, is so-and-so hiding in the house? And, maybe I'll lie to them and say no if I think that that's my only option for not having this person be murdered. So, like, that's a case where at least I can easily see a case being made for, like, yeah, you should lie on that circumstance. So it's not, we think it's wrong to lie, but we also think that people tend to think that there can be exceptions to that.
So I have one last question that kind of connects the first idea to the last idea, which is that aspiration seems based on the process of doing better. Would you agree?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Is it possible to base aspiration on a lie that you've told yourself?
So one thing that I argue in my book that I suppose should be more controversial than it is that I think that aspiration has to be veridical, which means when we see someone as aspiring to something, we have to think that that thing is good. And that when we don't think the thing is good, we don't call it aspiration, we call it by different names. So, like, when we, I talk about, like, the opening of Goodfellas, where the guy's like, ever since I was a kid, I always wanted to be a mobster, and it's this famous speech where he's like, I met the other mobsters and I look up to them and this is the life I wanted. And, like, I compare it to a pretty similar speech by Stephen King. Like, ever since I was a kid, I wanted to be a writer. And when we hear the Stephen King speech, we're like, oh, he was an aspiring writer. And he was, like, inchoately grasping this good of being a novelist. And he, and in the Goodfellas, we're like, he was just being duped by this system where it got him to, like, be twisted in seeing values and that weren't there. And right. So I think that, in effect, my answer to your question, can aspiration be based on a lie, is no. In that, like, whoever calls it aspiration thinks of it as being correct. And that just puts aspiration in the same family of terms as a word like see or remember. So if I say, I remember having met you guys before today, though I know I didn't, you're just like, wait, no, that you can't use the word remember like that, right? I could say I seem to remember it even though I didn't, right? But, like, remember always has to be true, right? Or, like, if I say, look, I see this cup even though it isn't there. No, you can't see things that aren't there. You could say I seem to see it, or I have an image of it, or I have an illusion or representation or something, but you can't see what isn't there. Or knowledge works the same way. Knowledge is veridical. If I say, I know that 2 + 2 is 4, 2 + 2 better be 4. You can't know things that aren't true. You can believe things that aren't true, but you can't know things that aren't true. Okay, so these family of words that are veridical in the sense that we only use them in the case where the thing is there. And I think aspiration's in that family. And so there are no false aspirations.
Well, Dr. Callard, it's been a pleasure.
So many things to think about.
Thank you so much.
It was very fun. Very nice to meet you guys.
Hope we can talk again one day.
Yeah.
Me too.
Take care.
Bye.